The photograph surfaced in the summer heat of Louisiana, inside a chest that had slept for nearly a century beneath the warped floorboards of a forgotten hospital wing. It was found during renovation, wrapped in oilcloth, sealed with twine that disintegrated at a touch. When the archivist unwrapped it, the room filled with the faint, sweet smell of old paper and something else, iron and lavender, the scent of antiseptic mixed with prayers. The image was fragile but intact, its corners curled like dried petals. Someone had written on the back in ink so faded it was nearly invisible, St. Mercy's Home, 1901, and beneath that, in lighter pencil, the words, 3 infants, 1 numbered twice. At first glance, the scene appeared ordinary. Another photograph of charity work in the South at the turn of the century. A veranda lined with wooden slats. A wicker crib resting under the slanted light. 3 infants sleeping side by side in thin cotton gowns. The kind of picture meant for donors, printed in church bulletins and parish reports. Proof that the poor were being cared for, that mercy had a place in the world. But mercy, in that photograph, seemed complicated. The longer one looked, the more the air inside the frame felt too still, too deliberate. The infants' small faces, though peaceful, carried no softness of breath, no trace of motion. Even the sunlight looked fragile, filtered and weary, as if it had passed through too many prayers before reaching the floorboards. The archivist turned the photograph under the light, letting it catch the grain of age. The wicker glowed pale, the muslin gowns shimmered faintly, and then on the tiny wrists, the marks appeared. Cloth identification bands, handwritten in graphite. Each bore a number, 17, 18, and again, 17. At first she assumed a mistake, a clerical repetition, a nurse's tired hand at the end of a long day. But when she examined the bands closer, the handwriting was not the same. One was bold, the other faint, as though pressed by a lighter hand. The repeated number was not an error, it was a correction, or a replacement. The archivist, Dr. Lillian Hart, had catalogued hundreds of photographs before, war records, family portraits, plantation registries, but this one held a stillness that unsettled her. It felt less like a moment captured, and more like a moment withheld, as if time itself had hesitated. Behind the infants, she noticed a woman standing near the door, the nurse, dressed in white. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes were cast downward toward the crib, her hands folded tightly in front of her apron. The light caught the corner of her jaw, illuminating the tremor in her mouth, and beyond her, through the half-open door labeled Infant Ward, a shadow lingered, taller, indistinct, as if another person had been standing inside the building, just far enough away for the camera to forget them. Lillian lifted her magnifying glass and leaned closer. The shadow's outline touched the edge of the doorframe, too clean, too fixed to be accidental, but no detail followed, no face, no features, just the impression of someone present. She placed the photo flat again. The air in her office seemed suddenly warmer, the hum of the ceiling fan slower. The wood of her desk creaked softly under her elbow, though she hadn't moved. Later that evening, she opened the old hospital ledger that had been found in the same chest. The records were written in looping cursive, the kind taught in convent schools, neat, patient, mercilessly organized. She turned to the year 1901. There it was, St. Mercy's Home for Abandoned Infants. Each line listed a number, a date, and a brief note. 17, male, 4 months, mother unknown. 18, female, 6 weeks, surrendered by parish sister. Then again, 17, male, 3 months, twin, presumed deceased. The ink stopped there. The rest of the line crossed out in darker strokes. Lillian frowned. The handwriting of the crossing marks was different, heavier, angular, impatient, and beside the line, written sideways, a note in faint pencil. Not the same child. She read it twice, then again. The air in the room shifted, the weightless kind of silence that follows when something is remembered by accident. Outside, the evening turned stormy. Thunder rolled across the low skyline, the kind that seemed to shake from beneath rather than above. The light in the archives flickered. Lillian placed the photograph aside, but even from the corner of her desk, it seemed to watch her. The repeating number, the empty veranda, the frozen symmetry of care. She turned it face down. On the back, the inked inscription caught her eye again. 3 infants, 1 numbered twice. The handwriting there was not the same as the ledger. It was a man's hand, slanted, confident, written with pressure. She rubbed her thumb lightly over the ink. It had bled slightly into the fibers, as if written in haste, perhaps even anger. Beneath that line, she noticed something faint, another indentation, nearly invisible unless caught by oblique light. She tilted the photograph and traced it with her nail. Slowly, the letters emerged. We only had room for one. She stopped breathing. For a moment she thought she had misread it, that it was just coincidence of creases and scratches, but the phrase was too perfect, too deliberate. Her eyes went back to the infants. Two slept facing left, one facing right. The one nearest the camera, the one whose band repeated the number 17, had a hand curled loosely around a corner of the blanket. The fingers looked almost in motion, as if caught mid-grip. The light on its skin was brighter than the others, unnaturally so, almost reflective. She leaned closer. The more she looked, the less it seemed like light at all. It was color, faint, golden, subtle, but undeniably different from the rest of the frame. The emulsion there had thickened, as if exposed twice. A double exposure. The same child photographed twice in the same moment. But how? That night, long after she left the office, the storm finally broke. The building groaned with thunder. Rain pressed against the windows like hands searching for entry. In the archive's quiet darkness, the photograph lay beneath a single desk lamp, its sepia tones flickering in the unstable light. If anyone had been there to see it, they might have noticed what happened next, how the faint reflection on the surface began to move. The ceiling fan's reflection turned once, then stopped. The crib's wicker shimmered faintly as if the weave itself exhaled, and the band on the nearest infant's wrist, the one marked 17, seemed to tremble ever so slightly, though no air stirred. A thin line of moisture formed along the edge of the photograph, curling across the surface like breath against glass. It traced down toward the corner where the handwritten note lay. When it reached the words, "We only had room for one," the drop of water spread, darkening the paper until the sentence vanished. In its place, under the trembling light, a new word appeared, faint, but visible enough to read. Why? The next morning, Lillian found the photograph dry again. The ink was gone, but the impression of the word remained, pressed into the paper's surface. She placed it back into its envelope and sealed it with shaking hands. Somewhere beyond the windows, the bells of St. Anne's Cathedral began to ring. Not loud, not mournful, simply there, echoing through the city's humid air. And though she could not explain why, the sound made her think of a cradle rocking slowly in rhythm, the kind that never truly stopped. The history of St. Mercy's Home for Abandoned Infants was scattered across ledgers and sermons, its paper bones resting in archives too tired to remember what mercy had meant. Founded in 1892 by the Sisters of Charity, the home had been built on a quiet street near the edge of the French Quarter, a place where humid air and magnolia blossoms mixed with the smell of river mud. From the outside, it looked like grace. Inside, it felt like penance. By the turn of the new century, the home was overflowing. The fever epidemic of 1900 had filled every cot, every spare corner of the nursery. Some infants arrived wrapped in prayer shawls, others left on doorsteps without names, their only inheritance a date and a number written by trembling hands. The system was simple, a numbered band for every child, tied with muslin, and logged by Sister Agnes in a thick ledger that smelled of candle wax and milk. 17 was a boy, pale skin, dark hair, born in March. 18 was a girl, small lungs, weak cry, baptized within hours of arrival. And then, a week later, another infant appeared. Identical band, same graphite number, same month, same mark of birth. The record kept by Sister Agnes read, "Child found on steps. No note. Resembles Tharm 17. The Lord knows his own." But the director, Father Benoit, added a note beside it, his handwriting large, angry and blunt. "Cannot keep both. Providence must decide." In the heat of that summer, Providence often looked like paperwork. Resources were scarce. The hospital down the street was full, and the charity's donations had thinned after rumors of mishandling funds. The sisters prayed, they rationed, and when there was not enough to go around, they chose. The older nurses never spoke of it. The younger ones learned quickly that silence was holy. Yet behind closed doors, the question hung heavy in the air. How does one decide who deserves to stay? Sister Agnes, who was barely 30 that year, had been the one assigned to care for both infants. She wrote of them in her private journal, in the same careful hand she used for her prayers. Lillian found those pages later, folded between the hospital's accounting books, ink faded but legible. "They are the same child," she wrote, "or near enough that it feels like sin to compare. The first boy was weak and quiet, the second restless with eyes that would not close. When I hold one, the other cries. When I hum to the other, both go still. I do not know which one is real. I do not know which one belongs here." The words struck Lillian like confession. They weren't written for anyone to read. They were written to survive the guilt of writing them. She turned the next page carefully. "Father says the Lord must take one, for the house cannot bear two mouths with one name. I told him they share not only the name but the breath. He told me breath cannot be divided. I fear he is wrong." Lillian's eyes lingered on the last entry, dated June 12, 1901, 2 weeks before the photograph was taken. "The fever took the first one. I was with him. The other slept through it, but when I laid him down, he turned his head toward the empty crib and smiled. I cannot explain what I saw. but I felt the room fill with a light that was not from the window. The band I tied to his wrist now bears both numbers on mine and God's. Below the entry, a smear of graphite marked the page, as if someone had dragged a finger across it before it dried. Lillian looked up from the paper. Her office felt smaller now, walls pressing closer with the weight of air that had once carried prayer. She turned back to the photograph on her desk. There they were, the 3 infants. The one with the doubled number looked almost awake. His tiny mouth curved upward, not into a smile but something near awareness, as though the child had been on the edge of speaking. She remembered the line she'd read the night before. We only had room for one. Perhaps that had never been about space. Perhaps it had been about reality itself. The following afternoon, she visited what remained of St. Mercy's home. The building still stood, its wooden bones warped by time and water, its shutters hanging crooked like tired eyelids. The plaque by the gate had long since rusted to illegibility, but the veranda, the same veranda from the photograph, was still there. The light was the same too, though thinner now, filtered through overgrown vines and the distant hum of the city. She stepped onto the wooden boards. They groaned beneath her, each one a note in a hymn too old to remember its melody. Dust floated in beams of light like ash suspended in grace. And there, in the corner where the crib had once been, she found it. A single fragment of cloth, brittle and yellowed, pressed beneath a loose floorboard. She lifted it carefully. It was part of an identification band. The number, faint but legible, read 17. But when she turned it over, the inside bore something else. A second mark, written in faint pencil. Together. She sat down hard, the sound of the boards echoing under her. The word was small, nearly lost to time, but its presence was enough. Together. It didn't sound like record keeping. It sounded like plea. That night, Lillian returned to the archive and laid the band beside the photograph. Under the lamp, the paper and fabric seemed to breathe the same color, sepia warmed by memory. She aligned them perfectly, side by side. The edges matched. She switched off the main light, leaving only the desk lamp, and in the half-dark she saw it, a faint shimmer that moved between the two objects as if one reflected the other. The photograph was not just remembering what it saw, it was reaching for what it lost. She stared until her eyes blurred, until the line between image and object dissolved. In her exhaustion, she imagined Sister Agnes sitting in that same light, folding the bands, whispering lullabies into linen. She imagined the infants breathing in tandem, one heart answering the other's pulse. And suddenly, the logic of mercy, of providence and choice, seemed impossibly small against the vastness of love that had no boundary, no number, no rule. The story the photograph told was not one of abandonment, it was one of return. Outside, the storm clouds began to gather again, the same southern kind that brings both ruin and relief. Lillian looked up at the dark window and caught her own reflection. For a heartbeat, she wasn't alone. A faint outline, delicate, flickering, stood beside her reflection, 2 small figures. For an instant, she thought she heard a sound, the faint rustle of cloth, like a baby turning in its sleep. When she looked down again, the band and the photograph were no longer separate. The number on the fabric had faded completely, leaving only one word behind: together. It was after midnight when Lillian decided to photograph the original print. Her intention was professional, documentation for preservation, a simple archival task, but there was nothing simple about that night. The building hummed with the tired quiet of old institutions. The air conditioner rattled softly. The streetlights outside painted faint stripes of amber across the floor. She positioned the photograph under her camera, adjusted the exposure, and took the shot. The digital image appeared on her screen. Precise, flat, ordinary. She exhaled. For a moment the past seemed contained, but when she zoomed in to adjust color balance, she froze. There, near the lower corner of the frame, something had changed. The photograph had always shown 3 infants. Now in the digital image, there were 4. The 4th figure was faint, like a ghosted reflection at first, a soft blur beside the crib. But as she adjusted contrast, the outline took shape, a small figure wrapped in gauze, lying apart from the others, half-shadowed. Its head was turned toward the child marked 17. She blinked, her breath fogging the monitor. She checked the print again. Only 3. Always 3. She looked back at the screen. 4. Her pulse quickened. She reopened the file, thinking it was a glitch, a digital echo from a previous frame. But every scan she made showed the same thing, the 4th child appearing where no one had ever been. She turned off the light. The room darkened to a soft amber glow from the hallway. The photo lay motionless on the desk, as inert as any century-old artifact should be. And yet, for the first time, Lillian wondered if photography, that invention of science and light, had always been less about capturing life and more about trapping memory. She made another scan, this time under ultraviolet. The results appeared slowly, building pixel by pixel on the screen, every grain of the old emulsion glowing faintly violet blue. She leaned closer. Under the faint handwriting of St. Mercy's Home, 1901, something new emerged. It wasn't ink, it wasn't scratch, it was chemical residue, a ghost image, invisible in daylight but luminous under the lamp. It was handwriting, and it said, "He did not die." Her throat tightened. She stepped back. The words faded almost instantly, replaced by the dull surface of the photograph once again. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself, half out of fear, half out of wonder, "What are you trying to show me?" The only answer was the quiet hum of the air vents. Over the following nights, Lillian returned again and again. She scanned, photographed, and documented each fragment, and with every new image the pattern changed slightly. Sometimes the shadow of the fourth child moved closer to the others. Sometimes the identification band on the wrist of 17 looked smudged, as if the graphite had softened overnight. Once, she swore she saw the faint reflection of a woman's hand in the window pane, thin fingers reaching toward the crib. She began keeping notes. Fourth figure appears under high exposure. Message visible only under UV light. Reflection repeats across scans, possibly residual emulsion memory, but no scientific explanation satisfied her. Something beneath logic was at work, something that belonged neither to the photograph nor to her. It was during one of those nights, as thunder rolled beyond the city, that she noticed the pattern on the wall. The framed photo hung under glass beside her desk now. When the lightning flashed, the reflection showed the 3 infants, but in the glass, not in the photograph, there was movement. The crib seemed to sway gently, as though rocked by unseen hands. She stood, heart thudding. The next flash came, another reflection. This time one of the infants turned its head. Her breath caught. She turned on the lamp, flooding the room with sterile light. The photograph was still, perfectly still, but when she leaned in, she saw something new pressed faintly into the emulsion near the corner. Not written, but embossed, as if by fingertip pressure. 4 tiny prints, the size of a child's hand. The following morning, she brought the photo to a forensic restorer she trusted, Dr. Everett Shaw, an expert in glass plate negatives. He was skeptical at first, then curious, then pale. When he ran spectral light tests across the image, he found traces of multiple exposures layered on top of each other, all from the same moment in time. "There are at least 2 different exposures here," he said quietly, his voice echoing in the dim lab. "Maybe 3. Same location, same lighting, same subject, but different arrangements. Someone rephotographed this image without moving the setup." Lillian frowned. "You mean the photographer made duplicates?" He shook his head. "Not duplicates. Overlaps, one on top of the other, perfectly aligned. That doesn't happen by mistake." He turned off the lights. The photo glowed faintly under the scanner, the silver particles catching the beam like dust in sunlight. "There's something else," he said after a long pause. "In the 4th exposure, the infant isn't lying still. It's sitting upright." That night, Lillian couldn't sleep. The rain returned, steady and patient. She sat at her kitchen table with the photograph under lamplight, tracing the edges of the frame with her fingertips. She thought of Sister Agnes and her journal. They share the breath. She thought of the ledger, not the same child, and of the note carved into the back of the print, "We only had room for one." Her mind began to weave something she couldn't yet call a theory, a story perhaps, or a memory that didn't belong to her. What if the second child hadn't died? What if Mercy had demanded one be hidden, not lost? What if someone had taken the photograph to remember both, to preserve the one they couldn't keep? Her thoughts circled endlessly, like the slow sweep of a fan that refused to stop turning. When she finally looked up, her reflection in the glass was gone. The photo showed only her chair, empty, with the faint shadow of a figure standing beside it, a tall man holding something small in his arms. The following day, she checked the hospital archives again. She searched not by number this time, but by repetition. Duplicate entries, twin births, anomalies in record keeping. She found only one that fit. Entry Dr. 17, corrected July 1901. Status, transferred. But to where? The answer came on the next line, written in faint graphite by a hand that had grown unsteady with age. Infant sent to Bayou Refuge, under protection of Father Benoit. She searched every directory, every registry. Bayou Refuge didn't exist anymore. The last mention appeared in a diocesan letter dated 1903. The mission at Bayou Refuge has been abandoned. Flooding claimed the land, and all records were lost. Lillian sat back, staring at the ceiling. She felt a strange stillness, the kind that comes not from peace but from proximity to truth. That night the photograph began to peel. It started at the edges, the gelatin layer lifting in fine curls, like the first flakes of old paint. She tried to stabilize it with gloves and tweezers, but as she did, something caught her eye. Underneath the surface emulsion, another image was hidden, a second exposure. She held it up to the lamp. The light bled through, illuminating shapes buried beneath. The same veranda, the same crib, but the nurse was gone. In her place stood a man in clerical robes, head bowed, holding a small white bundle in his arms. And on the wall behind him, barely visible, a single word scratched into the wood: Mercy. Lillian lowered the photo slowly, her hands trembling. It was no longer a mystery to be solved. It was a confession, written in light, hidden in layers, waiting for the century to end so someone might finally listen. She placed it flat on the table, the soft hum of thunder rolling in the distance. For a long time, she said nothing. Then, in the quiet, she whispered the only word that still made sense: together, and somewhere, whether in the air or in the film grain or in the memory that refused to die, something answered. The next morning, sunlight fell through the blinds in narrow bars of gold. Lillian hadn't slept. The photograph lay beside her, sealed once more in its protective sleeve, though every fiber of her wanted to touch it again, to peel back the surface, to press her thumb where the word mercy had appeared. But this was no longer about curiosity. It was about responsibility. She knew where she had to go next: the diocesan archives of New Orleans. The church kept everything: birth records, baptismal notes, orphanage transfers, sometimes out of guilt, sometimes out of pride. In those files, time itself was kept on paper, its edges curled and yellow, but never truly lost. The archivist at the diocese, an older man named Brother Alaric, met her with polite confusion when she asked for the records of St. Mercy's home. He frowned. That home closed before my grandfather's time. Most of its files were lost in the flood of 1923. I just need the ledger, Lillian said softly. The one they called the Mercy Ledger. It would have contained handwritten notes from Father Benoit. At the sound of that name, the brother's expression changed. He hesitated, then walked away without another word. When he returned, he carried a wooden box wrapped in oilcloth, the same kind that had once held the photograph. Some things, he said quietly, setting it down, should have been buried deeper. The box smelled of dust and candle wax. Inside were fragments of documents, half-burned baptismal papers, a rosary missing its crucifix, and a ledger swollen with water damage. Across the cover, written in ink that had bled and spread like roots, were the words, Misericordia Dei, the mercy of God. The pages crackled as Lillian opened them. The handwriting varied, some elegant, others rushed, many smudged. But near the center, one entry stood out: Infant 17, twin, unnamed, only one baptized, the other withheld for mercy. The phrase withheld for mercy sent a chill through her spine. She read it again and again. Below it, another note appeared, this one in a different hand, sharper, angrier, written with such pressure it tore slightly through the paper. I could not destroy what was given twice. It was signed, Agnes M. Lillian's pulse quickened. Sister Agnes had not obeyed. She had defied her order. She turned the next page. There was a gap. Several sheets missing, torn cleanly from the binding. The edges were darkened as if by fire. On the following surviving sheet, a final entry appeared, scrawled across the margin. One marked for heaven, one hidden in the light. Both seen, neither forgotten. She closed the book, trembling. It felt heavier than paper, as if holding the weight of everything the sisters had tried to erase. That night she returned home, unable to leave the ledger unopened. She spread its pages across her kitchen table, aligning them beside the photograph and the cloth band. Together they formed something like a pattern, a memory reconstructing itself piece by piece. She imagined the night in 1901 when the photograph had been taken, the veranda lit by oil lamps, the air thick with heat, the camera's tripod set with care. Father Benoit, solemn and silent, overseeing the moment. Sister Agnes holding one infant, her arms trembling. Another child already gone or hidden, wrapped in white. And then the click of the shutter, the capture of choice. But somewhere, somehow, that choice had failed to stay within its frame. Perhaps mercy had been too powerful to contain. As the hours passed, the city fell silent outside her window. The only sound was the slow tick of her wall clock, steady, deliberate, as if echoing the rhythm of something older. She felt the pull of sleep but refused it. There was still one thing left to understand, the repeated number. She reopened the ledger, tracing the faded graphite beside entry 17. Under the ink, another line was faintly visible, written in pencil so soft it was nearly invisible. She angled the page toward the lamplight. The graphite shimmered weakly, not a number, but a name, Elias. It was the only name in the entire ledger written in English letters. Every other entry was numbered. She whispered it aloud, Elias. And for the first time, the name didn't sound like a record. It sounded like a memory calling back. When dawn came, Lillian drove to the ruins of Bayou Refuge, or what remained of it. The land had long since reverted to swamp. reeds growing where the chapel once stood. Only the foundation stones remained, half submerged in water the color of rust. She waded through the shallow marsh, her shoes sinking into the silt. The air smelled of decay and rain. She reached what must have been the altar, a raised stone slab marked with lichen. Something glinted there, half buried in the mud. She knelt and brushed it clean. It was a small brass tag, no larger than a coin. The engraving was simple, hand-stamped, 17E. She turned it over. On the back, faint but still legible, another word appeared, alive. Her hand began to shake. She looked up toward the horizon, where mist hung low over the marsh, golden in the morning light. The silence felt deliberate, like a pause between two breaths. She whispered again, barely audible, Elias. And somewhere in the distance, through the reeds, came a faint reply. Not a sound, but a motion, a ripple across the water that moved against the wind. Back in the city, she developed her photographs of the site, but in one frame, something was wrong. The brass tag, which she'd photographed alone on the altar stone, wasn't alone anymore. Beside it, faint but visible, lay a strip of cloth, frayed, stained, tied in a loop. And though she hadn't seen it at the time, the fabric bore a faint mark in faded graphite, the number 18. The twin had been there too. That night, she laid all the evidence before her, the band marked together, the ledger's torn pages, the photograph, and the image of the brass tag. It wasn't death that had separated them. It was choice, one born of desperation, sanctified by fear. One child kept for mercy, one hidden for survival. But memory, like light, refuses to fade where love still lingers. The photograph wasn't a relic. It was a promise, one that time had been waiting for someone to hear. In the silence of her apartment, she turned the photograph once more. The repeated number was still visible, though fainter now, the graphite softened by age. She ran her finger gently across it. For a heartbeat, the room grew colder. The hum of the city outside dulled to nothing, and from somewhere within that fragile layer of emulsion, a whisper emerged. Not sound, not air, but vibration, like breath against glass. It said only one word, remember. Lillian closed her eyes. She felt tears she hadn't meant to shed. She understood now that memory isn't owned by the living. It's borrowed, and sometimes returned in forms we don't recognize. She turned off the light. The photograph glowed faintly in the dark. It rained again the following evening, the kind of soft, unending rain that blurs the edges of everything it touches. The city lights outside Lillian's apartment looked like small floating prayers, each one reflected twice in the glass. She sat at her desk, the photograph before her, the ledger open beside it. The world had narrowed to this, a century of silence collapsing into one moment of clarity. The surface of the photograph, under lamplight, seemed almost to breathe. She'd spent days convincing herself it was only age, the gentle shifting of paper fibers, the rise of trapped air beneath glass. But tonight, she knew better. Some things move not because of time, but because they've been waiting long enough to be remembered. She adjusted the light and leaned closer. Where the word mercy had once appeared beneath the surface, another shimmer rose, faint, silver, and slow. It wasn't a word this time, it was a shape, the outline of two small hands overlapping, the same twin touch she'd seen embossed into the photograph before. Her chest ached. The sound of rain deepened, steady as breath. In that stillness, she began to imagine the night Sister Agnes took the photograph, the lamp flickering, the sound of glass plates shifting, the murmur of a prayer spoken too softly to be heard by anyone but God. Perhaps Agnes had understood what mercy meant, not as forgiveness, but as remembrance, to hold what others couldn't bear to look at, to preserve love even when it no longer had a body. That was what this photograph had done. For 111 years, Lillian closed her eyes. The room pulsed faintly with thunderlight, the lamp's glow rising and falling like breath. For a moment she could hear voices, or maybe echoes, faint, melodic, layered like the double exposure itself. Not words, just the hum of existence, the kind of sound memory makes when it refuses to die. She felt something between peace and grief. When she opened her eyes again, the photograph looked different. The three infants were still there, but their faces seemed gentler now, less solemn. The crib's shadow stretched wider, and within it, a fourth outline lingered, no longer hidden, no longer faint. And there, beneath the faint graphite of the repeated number, a new word had appeared, etched so softly it might have been imagined. Home. She smiled, a small, private smile, the kind meant for things that no one else would ever believe. She turned the ledger's final page. It was blank, except for a watermark in the paper, the faint impression of two rings intersecting. She thought again of the word together, written by a hand more than a century old, and understood that it had never been about the twins alone. It had been about every soul that had passed through that place, every name replaced by a number, every number waiting to be named again. Memory wasn't a wound, it was a form of faith. When dawn came, The rain had stopped. The window was fogged with pale light, and the sound of church bells carried faintly from somewhere downtown. Lillian stood, walked to the window and opened it. The air smelled of wet earth and magnolia. She placed the photograph on the windowsill, the rising sun catching its silver edges. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was studying the past. She felt like the past was looking back. The light touched the photograph, and in that instant, something inside it shifted. The reflection showed not her own face, but a quiet veranda, bathed in morning glow, with two small figures seated together. One held the other's hand. Both smiled, softly, as if relieved to finally be seen. Then as the light grew brighter, the image faded, not disappearing but merging into the whiteness of day. Lillian whispered, "You can rest now." The air was still. Then, for the briefest second, she heard a reply, the faintest sound, lighter than breath, smaller than a heartbeat. It said, "So can you." That evening, when the museum staff found her office empty, they assumed she'd gone home early. On her desk, under a sheet of tracing paper, lay the photograph, sealed, cleaned, perfectly preserved. Beside it, a small handwritten note, 2 names, 1 memory, Mercy, fulfilled, and below it, her signature, followed by a single, familiar word, together. The photograph was later added to the museum's permanent collection, catalogued under anonymous, circa 1901, St. Mercy's Home, New Orleans. But curators who worked the night shift often said that the glass of its frame fogged slightly when the lights were dimmed, as though something inside was still breathing. Some swore they could see a faint shimmer, 2 small figures in the reflection, side by side, waiting beneath the light. No one could ever capture it on camera, but those who had stood there long enough knew the past doesn't vanish. It listens. Veilside Stories, where forgotten photographs remember for us. If this story moved you, subscribe to Veilside Stories. More lost images await, each one whispering through the frame, waiting for someone patient enough to listen.